Hi, I'm Tim. Join me in this video as we go through 10 questions and answers on remote ID. Let's get to it. Remote ID is a hot topic among RC models today, both fixed-wing and drone flyers. The rules don't come into effect until September 16th, 2023. This is being filmed in April of 2023, but there's a lot of questions: what it does, what it doesn't do I have to comply? And in this video, I'll go through 10 common questions that I received from viewers on this and some discussions with the answers. Please note also throughout this video, in the description, all the questions are listed with the timestamps. If you want to hover over the timeline, you can go directly to that chapter. So the first question for the new viewer: what is remote ID? Remote ID is a new ruling from the FAA, first formulated about 2021. And what it is, it's a means that you can track a drone, whether it's a quadcopter or RC model airplane, basically an unmanned aircraft in the air. It knows various technical issues of the flight, the geolocation, the altitude, the airspeed, and it also knows the takeoff location of that aircraft. There are three basic ways that we will comply with remote ID. The first is that with the remote ID technology, the transmitter will be built into the drone as it is being built. That rule became effective December 22nd, 2022. So as of today, April 2023, all drones being manufactured are compliant with remote ID. The other way to comply, second of three ways to comply, is to get a module that you put in your aircraft. The module performs the remote ID function, and you can swap it out between your models. You just need one module for a recreational flyer. And the third area is the FAA is setting aside areas that are going to not require remote ID at all. They're called FRIAs. It's an FAA Recognized Identification Area. They have to be linked to a community-based organization. The Academy of Model Aeronautics, AMA, is working with the FAA to establish FRIAs. AMA is looking to establish about 2,500 FRIAs. As of now, none have been approved, but that will be the third method to comply with remote ID. It's important to keep in mind that remote ID is in response to the explosive growth of drones in the world, both hobbyists, what we fly. Also, there's a great number of commercial applications, delivering packages, inspecting buildings, pipelines, crop dusting, and so forth. The remote ID is a foundational aspect of the integration of these drones into the National Airspace System. And as we'll discuss in the video, it's not just the US, but Europe and Asia have remote ID requirements as well. A question that's often asked is, how close does somebody have to be to track your drone when it's flying? The answer is we really don't know. What has happened is the FAA, when they established a remote ID requirement, the FAA took a little bit of a unique approach, in that the FAA did not tell manufacturers precisely what they had to make. It was just parameters and capabilities. Whatever they decided to make had to be met. And so the manufacturers had to get approval of a means of compliance. And if they could meet those means of compliance, then they would be certified by the FAA with a remote ID. Right now, in April of 2023, there's probably about 80 drones with various manufacturers that are approved for remote ID with the FAA. You can check this on the FAA website. And what happens is the FAA doesn't really know what the compliance technical means will be. It just has to meet Part 15 of the Federal Communications Commission rules because they're transmitting in the air. And the FAA believes once these come out and are used, it could be hundreds of meters away from the drone. You can pick up the signal up to several kilometers. So just judging on that, probably below 3 miles is going to be pretty hard to track a drone. We have to wait to see what it looks like with a finished drone, however the manufacturer came up with a means of compliance to do that, and also the radio signal environment. So it'll just depend. And also, it's very important to emphasize or re-emphasize that the remote ID signal, that comes from the drone itself. It doesn't come from your smartphone or a ground station. That is a signal emanated by the drone. Another question that comes up a lot is, how is the FAA going to enforce these drone regulations, remote ID? And it's important to note at the beginning that the FAA writes a lot of regulations. The regulations cover everybody, even you watching this video. It could be pilots, it could be flight attendants, air traffic controllers, mechanics. And where you come into play is a passenger on a commercial airline. If you're not following FAA regulations, if a flight attendant tells you to do something, you can run afoul of the FAA. So it depends on the situation, the severity of the incident, whether the person should have known better. A commercial airline pilot will probably be treated a little bit differently than a private pilot. In the very early days of remote ID with this, the FAA is probably going to take more of a cooperative approach rather than an adversarial approach. If something goes wrong, they'll call up, gather the facts, and try to educate and inform going out from there. Again, it'll depend on the severity of the incident. There was a case about a year ago of a drone operator at night. There was a police incident at a pharmacy in Los Angeles, the LA Basin. The guy was flying his drone at night to get some pictures. He wound up hitting a police helicopter, forced the helicopter to land. But even that was handled fairly well by the courts. I think it was a suspended sentence. It was not a severe penalty. So it's important to keep in mind the FAA is not the ATF. They don't have agents with guns that are going to come get you. There's inspectors sitting at desks, and very often what will turn a drone operator in is somebody will call the police, and there's an increasing level of cooperation between law enforcement and the FAA. You can see this on the Drone Zone portion of their website, educating local police what to do if there's a drone complaint from a neighbor, property, something of that nature. And again, it'll depend on the area. The FAA takes a risk-based analysis of how they do their work. There's probably going to be a lot more concern over drones flying in Los Angeles International Airport airspace than somewhere in North Dakota. We'll have to see how that plays out. One other thing I do want to mention is important for modelers with the FAA. Don't get too complacent, because there are aspects of the FAA where they're deadly serious. And a very good example of that is a TFR, or temporary flight restriction. I have other videos on TFRs. I'll put the link in the description. And the TFR is put in place as a temporary restriction for some important event, think the Super Bowl. But another fairly routine usage of TFR is anytime the President and Air Force One travels, the FAA will put out a temporary flight restriction around the location of the presidential party. These TFRs can go out to 30 miles, up to 10,000 feet, and the Secret Service, the FAA, is deadly serious about the enforcement of these TFRs. There was a case a few years ago where the president went into Chicago. There was a person flying their Piper Cub in Wisconsin, had no idea the president was even in Chicago, clipped the TFR by about a mile. And that was enough to trigger a response with Blackhawks. The person was forced down, arrested. It was not pretty. It's just a matter of time before some drone operator unaware of TFRs is going to fly into a TFR, and that will be just another situation they'll have to deal with. And as an aside, it's always good to check for TFRs. The FAA can do that on their website. I'm very fortunate with our club here. The club officers will put out a notice anytime a president flies in here. I'm within 30 miles of Atlanta Airport, and so just a heads up for that. What do I do if I have a plane that I've built and it is not remote ID compliant, and I want to fly after September 16th, 2023, when the rules come into effect? The answer is a remote ID module. This will be a module, you'll buy just one. You can swap it out between your aircraft. I would love to give you more details on these remote ID modules. The problem is, with my research, and I talk to a lot of people and manufacturers, there's only one example of a remote ID module that I can find, and there's been interviews with the guy who did it. It's called Drone Tag. It's a European company. It's a very talented Czech Republic engineer that has developed this. As I mentioned earlier, the European Aviation Safety Agency, the European equivalent of the FAA, is working to implement remote ID in Europe. It's a little bit different approach with different categories of drones, but this Drone Tag remote ID module that you can buy is about $300 and pretty big and heavy. That is more for industrial applications. It's not really designed for the hobbyist. However, the company, as well as Futaba and other companies, are hard at work making remote ID modules for hobbyists like myself that'll be lightweight and can fit into just your regular models and swap out between. The issue is, because it's still 6 months away from the implementation, the need for the remote ID in September 16th, 2023, there's no rush to get it to market. I would see more movement on these remote ID modules in summer of 2023, but I'm confident there will be affordable, lightweight remote ID modules that you can use for your aircraft. So we mentioned earlier the FRIAs, the FAA Recognized Identification Area. This is an airspace where the FAA understands there's a club, some community-based activity there, and they permit aircraft to fly here within this airspace limits, typically altitudes up to 400 feet above AGL. So the FAA will establish FRIAs with what they call community-based organizations. That's their way of doing it. The first community-based organization was the Academy of Model Aeronautics. There's about 3 others that are recognized. Surely more to follow: schools, educational institutions, and so forth. The AMA is leading the way because they've got to come up with a methodology of how individual clubs apply, and the FAA approves. It'll all be through the AMA. The AMA has reached out to club officers. There are many applications in place. The FAA has these. They're still reviewing them. The FAA doesn't expect a response on any FRIAs till summer of 2023. So right now, in April of 2023, there are no FRIAs anywhere. There are none. The FRIAs, to me, make a lot of sense because they don't cost any money. It's just a paperwork exercise. You don't need to buy anything. I think it'll be a good common sense approach to this aspect of remote ID that lets hobbyists at a club fly. I understand there might not be a club in the middle of Montana or where you want to go, but it's a starting point as we understand and work within the rules of the remote ID ruling. So the question always comes up, and I agree, that if you are waiting till the summer to approve FRIAs, what if it doesn't all get done by September 16th of 2023? The answer is, today nobody really knows, but I am absolutely certain, and I worked in Washington for 7 years when I was at the Pentagon in these complex interagency discussions. If it comes up to crunch time and there's not enough FRIAs being approved, the FAA will simply slip that compliance date from September 16th, 2023 to sometime later. But again, we'll have to wait to see how that all pans out. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, the question came up with remote ID just a US FAA concern, or is it elsewhere? The answer is it's around the world. The European Aviation Safety Agency, the European equivalent of the FAA, is implementing their own remote ID rules. It's a little bit different for commercial and hobbyist use. And in my contacts with Futaba, Japan is hard at work with remote ID capability. Again, there's a lot of industrial capabilities that Japanese industry uses for drones, and that should flow into the hobbyist sector here in the summertime or so. Again, drones are being used everywhere. It's a hugely expanding industry. So these unmanned aircraft, they're a new thing in the national airspace systems of nations around the world. Remote ID is a pretty important aspect of that integration, and we'll just have to wait to see how things work out. But it's not just the US that does remote ID. It's a worldwide phenomenon. So sometimes I get questions, well, does the FAA have the authority to regulate drones? What gave them the right to do that? And the short answer is yes. The FAA is in charge of the national airspace system. That's basically all the air over the United States. The FAA can write the rules on who does what, where. Now, obviously, there's a lot of users of the national airspace system, so the FAA understands that and works with them. Keep in mind, even the military, when a fighter aircraft, F-35, whatever, takes off, once they leave their base, they're talking to FAA controllers. They need permission from the FAA to change altitudes, to deviate around thunderstorms, clearance to land, approach, all that stuff. The FAA even has oversight for space launches. So SpaceX can oftentimes be delayed on a launch of one of their rockets because they have to get FAA approval for use of that airspace. So drones are part of that. Now, in the past, the FAA essentially looked the other way with unmanned aircraft because they were fixed-wing RC models. We tended to stay within visual sight because there was no GPS. We had to see the model to fly it. We tended to fly in clubs by and large, and we didn't go too high above ground, and we didn't get straight into controlled airspace too much. There might have been a few RC clubs near a local airport, but they would have what's called letters of agreement to work out their operations. Well, all that changed about 2005 or so when drones became commonplace. Remember, the key thing with a drone quadcopter is that person is generally flying the drone to get pictures, video, or still pictures of something, and the drones can go everywhere. So now drones are flying into a lot of spaces where they never saw unmanned aircraft before. The FAA keeps a track of this database. There's about 100 reported incursions of drones by pilots of other aircraft, commercial airliners, private pilots, and so forth. And so the FAA is concerned, Congress is concerned, hence the direction by Congress to the FAA to come up with a remote ID policy, which is where we are here. Now, it's still a work in progress. I get some comments, well, what about a baseball bat hit into the air? Do they control that? No. But if there were a lot of baseballs or, say, a golf driving range, the FAA could get involved in that. And just one kind of funny example of that, when I was flying commercially, we would often fly into Boston's Logan Airport, and you would have minimum altitudes to go around on a missed approach. And what would happen is, it was a note, if there were what they call tall ships in Boston Harbor, there were actually higher minimums for the approach because you needed that extra distance to clear the tall masts of these sailing ships that were in the harbor. So again, the FAA is aware of a lot of this stuff. So the FAA can regulate drones. We do need to comply with the regulations, but it is a work in progress. I also get a question is, well, gee, why are drones and RC model aircraft lumped together? They should separate them. We're different people. We fly differently and all that stuff. I understand that. The problem is the FAA deals with a lot of aircraft flying that they have to regulate. Things, sailplanes, fixed-wing aircraft, helicopters, people doing parachute jumps at airports. It's just a lot of aircraft up there. So what the FAA has done is they've called it, I'm going to read my notes here, UAS, which is an Unmanned Aircraft System. And a UAS is actually defined in statute with law. And a UAS is an aircraft that is operated without the possibility of direct human intervention from within or on the aircraft. Or in other words, a UAS is an aircraft of any size without a pilot on board. This is an important distinction because the FAA puts a great deal of weight on the fact that there is a pilot in any aircraft. The idea is the pilot can make decisions, they can maneuver the aircraft, they can avoid other aircraft, they could possibly make radio calls if there's a radio installed in the aircraft. With drones, none of this is possible, at least right now. The drone cannot be told to maneuver left or right, see somebody, avoid an accident. So that's why the FAA has just lumped UASs as a category of aircraft, and fixed-wing models and drones were put together for the purposes of how the FAA approaches drone RC aircraft operations. So the question sometimes comes up, well, I'm just not going to comply with remote ID. I'm just not going to follow it. I don't like it. They can't tell me what to do, whatever the reasons are. And my response to that is, it's a personal decision. I'm not going to, I can't tell you to go one way or the other. As a pilot for 50 years, to include finishing up as a commercial pilot, you cannot believe the number of regulations we have to comply with to be legal to fly. Everything from the number of landings, flying at night, medicals, just all sorts of stuff. So I understand those regulations, I embrace them. I don't mind following the regulations. I think it's for a greater good. However, for the drone operator, you're going to have to make that determination on your own. I would say, as I mentioned earlier, that there will be more focus on busy terminal areas, Los Angeles, Atlanta, New York, for drone operations because it's just busier, more congested airspace, probably less so than if you're flying in Montana or North Dakota. Also, as the FAA gets more comfortable with understanding drone operations, what they can do and can't do, for example, for civilian aircraft, if you're a Cessna operator, pilot, The FAA can do a ramp check at any time. They can come up to your aircraft and just say, this is a ramp check, and you have to stop and answer any questions the FAA pose. They will probably want to see your license, they'll want to see a medical, they'll want to see the aircraft registration, items of that nature, just to make sure that the aircraft is in compliance with regulations. As I mentioned before, it happens more often than you would realize. Somebody will call up the FAA and says, I think there's a problem with such and such, you might want to take a look at it. And based on that tip, it could be a ramp check, further inspection, paperwork, whatever. So it's just, you're going to have to make a decision on the remote ID. I think it's going to be less of a problem because remote ID is just going to happen in the background. Manufacturers today are building drones that are remote ID compliant. So for sure, after September 16th, 2023, every drone that everybody buys is going to be remote ID compliant. I would think it makes a lot of sense for these manufacturers, because they are figuring out remote ID, to simply incorporate that technology into new receivers for regular RC model aircraft. If that's the case, that will just migrate kind of in the background into everyday flying. And I am confident the remote ID modules will come into play. As I mentioned, this is an example of the ultra micro receiver. This, for $50 unit, has the receiver, electronic speed control, and 2 servos all built into one thing, and it weighs nothing. So if this can exist, if industry can create this, I think we are in good shape with something as fairly simple as remote ID. But again, we'll have to wait, and it's your decision whether or not you're going to comply with a remote ID. Finally, I'm asked, does the FAA show any flexibility at all in discussions on what to do or not to do in remote ID? And the answer is they do. Remember when the draft rule came out in about 2020, I believe it was open for comments, as any important draft ruling will be. The FAA received 54,000 comments. I wrote in one comment about what to do, what not to do, ideas from modelers. And this was in discussions with the AMA, Experimental Aircraft Organization, Aircraft Owners and Pilot Association. Various entities had a discussion with the FAA. And one thing that was a pretty drastic change, the FAA in their original formulation of remote ID, they wanted everybody, before you took off with a drone or an RC model aircraft, you had to log into some national network through cell phone technology to track your drone. It was explaining this is going to shut down the entire hobby. There's vast areas of the country where you might not be able to do this. It's just not the technical capability. So the FAA backed off. There was a huge change, and it's now just a broadcast capability for remote ID while the drone is flying. Also, the original implementation date for manufacturers to have remote ID installed at their manufacturing facility was originally September 16th, 2022. Manufacturers were not able to keep up with that. It was slipped to December 16th, and that's the last I've heard of that, so that was some change. I think the FRIAs are going to be an interesting thing to watch, because the FRIAs, even at this early date with no FRIAs being established, the AMA has reached an understanding with the FAA to increase the altitude of FRIAs. Right now, it's at 400 feet above ground level. For sanctioned AMA contests and events, depending on the location of controlled airspace above that event, the maximum altitude could be raised to 700 feet AGL or 1,200 feet AGL, depending on the area. So that is an example of just discussions, flexibility, common sense ways to approach drone operations where they can safely operate the drone without impacting manned or aircraft operations. And I expect more of that to follow. We're just going to have to stay tuned. So again, we're in the very early stages of remote ID. Remember, nothing is required to be done on remote ID till September 16th, 2023. That's the date when everybody has to be compliant. And so there'll be further discussions, understanding as this important event goes along. Thank you for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos as we expand and grow our understanding of remote ID.